The laughter echoed through the garden like a crack of thunder. Monica Brooks stood at the center of her manicured estate, surrounded by the most powerful people money could gather. Investors, executives, celebrities, and socialites, all holding crystal glasses and wearing smiles that cost more than most people's homes. The evening air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh-cut roses. And at the edge of it all, partially hidden by the shadow of a flowering hedge, stood a man with soil on his gloves and questions in his eyes. His name was Andre Walker, and in less than 60 seconds, his entire life was about to change. Monica turned toward him, her red dress catching the golden light of the outdoor chandelier. She had a check in her hand. She raised it slowly the way someone raises a trophy. The number on it read $10,000. The guests leaned in, amused before she even spoke. "Andre," she called out, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who knows every eye is on them. "Come here." He walked over calmly. "No hurry, no fear." "I hear you have big dreams," Monica said, tilting her head with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "That you want to do something with your life." "Yes, ma'am," Andre replied quietly. Monica looked at her guests, then back at him. "Well then," she extended the check. "Maybe this will help you stop dreaming and start living in reality." The crowd erupted. Laughter rolled across the garden like a wave. Someone at the back started recording on their phone. A woman near the fountain covered her mouth, not from shame but from entertainment. Monica's business partner slapped his knee. Andre stood still. He looked down at the check. Then he looked up at Monica, directly into her eyes, and said 7 words that would echo through the next 12 months of both their lives. "One day, you'll wish you never gave me this." The crowd laughed even harder, thinking it was desperation, thinking it was the wounded pride of a man with nothing. But it wasn't. It was a promise. And exactly 1 year later, Andre Walker walked back into Monica Brooks' life. Not as her gardener, not as the butt of a joke that had gone viral online, but as the man holding documents that would shake the foundation of everything she thought she owned. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now let's get into this. To understand what happened that night, you have to go back, way back, because the story didn't begin at that party. It began decades earlier, in a small house where a woman sat at a kitchen table every evening with old papers spread in front of her like a map to a buried world. Her name was Iris Walker, Andre's grandmother. She was a quiet woman by nature, the kind who observed more than she spoke, who kept her feelings folded neatly like letters that were never sent. But on one subject she was relentless, unyielding, almost obsessed. "We had something," she used to say to young Andre when he sat beside her after school. "Your grandfather built something important, and it was taken from us." Andre would look at the papers, old, yellowed, covered in names and numbers and dates, and nod politely. He was 12. He didn't understand most of what she showed him, but he understood the pain behind her voice, the way her hands trembled slightly whenever she held one particular document, a faded business agreement with 2 names at the bottom. One name he recognized, Walker. The other name he didn't think much about at the time, Brooks. Iris would fold the papers carefully, tuck them back into a worn leather folder, and sigh the kind of sigh that carried the weight of years. "One day the truth will find you," she would whisper, "even when you stop looking for it." Andre loved his grandmother deeply, but as he grew older, got a job, built a life, he quietly filed her words under the category of grief. He thought she was a woman who had lost her husband too young and had constructed a story to make the loss mean something. People do that. They turn their suffering into conspiracy because randomness is harder to accept than betrayal. So he let it go. He took a job as a gardener. It was honest work. He had steady hands, a quiet disposition, and a real understanding of how living things grow. He didn't need much. A roof, a routine, enough to eat, enough to send a little to his mother every month. He ended up at the Brooks estate almost by accident, a referral through a landscaping company. The estate was massive, the kind of property where you could spend an entire morning on one section of lawn. Monica Brooks lived there, though he rarely saw her in those early months. She moved through the world like a weather system. You knew she was coming before she arrived. Her staff straightened instinctively. Her guests smiled on command. Andre trimmed hedges and pruned rose bushes and laid mulch in silence. And that was enough. Until the night of the party. Monica had organized one of her signature celebration dinners, an annual gathering of her inner circle, a blend of networking and performance design to remind everyone of exactly who she was. The guest list read like a financial directory. The food was catered by a team of 6. The flowers in the garden had been specially arranged the week before. Andre had done much of that arranging himself. He hadn't been invited to stay for the event. He was there finishing the final touches on a section of topiary near the east garden when the guests began arriving. He should have left. But a sprinkler head near the main fountain had been giving trouble, and he wanted to fix it before morning. That decision kept him there. And that's how he ended up at the edge of a garden full of wealthy strangers when a guest spotted him and decided to make conversation. "Hey, you there," the man called out jovially, the way wealthy people sometimes speak to service workers. Loudly, as if volume compensates for intimacy. "What would you do with $1 million?" A few guests turned to look. Andre straightened up, wiped his hands on his work trousers. "I'd investigate my family's past," he said simply. There was a moment of silence. Then someone laughed. Then someone else. Then the laughter spread like fire finding dry wood, moving from person to person until the entire corner of the garden was lit with it. Monica had been standing nearby, watching. She processed the moment with the instincts of a showman. "Your family's past?" she repeated, walking closer, tilting her head with theatrical curiosity. "That's what you'd spend $1 million on? Not a house, not a car, your family's past." "Yes," Andre said. He didn't elaborate. Monica looked at her guests. They were watching, entertained, waiting to see what she would do with this moment. She reached into the small envelope clutch she was carrying. She had been handing out a charity check earlier in the evening, $10,000 for a local children's fund. She had one more check blank with her. She uncapped her pen. She wrote a number, $10,000. She tore it off and extended it toward Andre. "Here," she said. "Maybe this will help you stop dreaming and start living in reality." The words landed like a slap. The crowd roared. Andre looked at the check for a long moment. The person filming moved closer, angling their phone to capture his face. He took the check slowly. Then he raised his eyes to Monica's, and in those eyes she saw something she wasn't expecting. Not humiliation, not gratitude, not even anger, certainty. "One day," he said, "you'll wish you never gave me this." She held his gaze for a beat too long before breaking into a dismissive smile. She waved her hand. "The gardens look beautiful, Andre. You can go home now." He folded the check carefully, put it in his breast pocket and walked away. The video was posted online by midnight. By morning, it had been viewed over 200,000 times. By the end of the week, over 4 million. Comment sections filled with reactions. Some people mocked Andre. Others mocked Monica. A few picked apart his final words, replaying them, dissecting the look on his face. One comment, buried among thousands, read, "That man wasn't embarrassed. He looked like someone who just found a key." They weren't wrong. Andre did not deposit the check immediately. He sat with it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he made a phone call. Then another. Then a third. He spent an evening going through a box he hadn't opened in 6 years. His grandmother's things. The leather folder was still there. The papers inside were more fragile than he remembered. He laid them on the kitchen table under a bright lamp and read them, slowly, this time with adult eyes. And this time, things he hadn't understood at 12 began to crystallize. The business agreement he'd seen as a child showed 2 names, 2 signatories. His grandfather, James Walker, and a man named Gerald Brooks. There was a company name at the top of the document. There were asset descriptions, property values, investment figures, his grandfather's handwriting in the margins. Andre sat back. Gerald Brooks, Monica's father. He picked up his phone and called a researcher, a retired academic who specialized in business and property history. Her name was Dr. Phyllis Okafor, and she had a reputation for finding things that institutions preferred stayed buried. Andre had read about her in an article once and had, for reasons he couldn't explain at the time, saved her contact information. "I have some old documents," he told her. "I need to know what they mean." 3 weeks later, Dr. Okafor called him back. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of a professional who had learned to present difficult findings without leading the witness. "Andre," she said, "where did you say you got these?" "My grandmother. She kept them her whole life." A pause. "I need you to come in and bring everything you have." The office was small, crammed with files and framed degrees and the smell of old books. Dr. Okafor had laid his documents out on a long table beside printed records she had pulled from public archives. She stood at one end, arms crossed, looking at the spread the way a doctor looks at a scan before explaining a diagnosis. "The business your grandfather and Gerald Brooks started," she began, "was registered as a joint venture. Equal partners. 50-50 ownership. This is documented. It's in the registration filings, the tax records from the early years, the original bank account signatures." She tapped each document as she named it. "Your grandfather was not a minor investor. He wasn't staff. He was a co-founder." Andre said nothing. He was very still. "Your grandfather passed away." She checked her notes. "Suddenly. A heart attack. He was 61. "Yes," Andre said. "My grandmother told me." "Within 18 months of his death," Dr. Okafor continued, "something happened that shouldn't have been possible without your family's knowledge and consent." She pulled out a set of documents and placed them in front of him. The ownership structure of the company was altered. A new set of incorporation papers replaced the originals. Your grandfather's name was removed. Andre stared at the papers. "Removed," he repeated. Quietly, legally on the surface because the paperwork was filed correctly, except for one thing. She pointed to a signature. "This is supposed to be your grandmother's signature, authorizing the transfer of your grandfather's estate share." Andre leaned closer. "That's not her handwriting," he said. "No," Dr. Okafor agreed. "It isn't." The room was very quiet. "She was right," Andre said softly. "She was right this whole time." He didn't cry. Not yet. He just sat there with the truth spreading across his understanding like dawn, slow and enormous and impossible to look at directly. He contacted a lawyer that same week. A man named Raymond Holt, who specialized in estate and inheritance disputes, particularly those involving fraud. Holt was precise, unromantic about it, and thorough to the point of obsession. "This is complex," Holt told him at their first meeting. "Decades old. The people who did this were careful. We'll need more than what you have." "Then we find more," Andre said. Holt nodded slowly. "You understand this could take months, and it will cost significant money." Andre placed the folded check on the desk between them. $10,000. Signed by Monica Brooks. "I have a starting point," he said. "What happened next happened slowly, then all at once, the way most life-altering things do." The investigation moved through weeks of silence and then sudden revelations. Holt hired 2 additional researchers. Dr. Okafor expanded her search. A forensic document specialist was brought in to examine the signatures. The deeper they dug, the more the ground shifted beneath them. Files that should have existed didn't. Offices claimed records had been lost in moves, in floods, in fires, the usual explanations institutions give when truth becomes inconvenient. Witnesses who had worked for Gerald Brooks in the relevant years were difficult to locate. Some had died. A few simply refused to speak. One afternoon, a man Andre didn't recognize called his personal number. "Mr. Walker," the voice said, "I think you should stop what you're doing." Andre gripped his phone. "Who is this?" "Someone who wants to protect you from making a very large mistake." "I appreciate the concern," Andre said. But I'll take my chances. A week later, his office was broken into. The physical copies of several documents were taken. Fortunately, Holt had long since made digital backups stored in multiple secure locations. The break-in rattled Andre, but it also told him something important. Someone was watching, and someone was afraid. The fear of powerful people is its own kind of evidence. Meanwhile, across the city, Monica Brooks was having a different kind of week. The viral video had been amusing at first. Her publicist called to say her engagement numbers had spiked. A few late-night comedy accounts had shared clips. Monica had laughed about it over dinner with friends, performing the story with self-awareness that read as confidence. But then, gradually, something shifted. First came a quiet comment from her head of legal affairs, Marcus Ellery, a careful man who had served her family's business interests for 15 years. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that there had been some inquiries from an external law firm. Nothing specific, nothing formal, just inquiries. Monica frowned. About what? Historical company records, Marcus said. Ownership documentation. The early years. Gerald's era? Yes. She said nothing for a moment. Handle it. But Marcus didn't look as relaxed as she wanted him to. Monica, he said, setting down his pen. Marcus never set down his pen unless something was serious. I think you should speak with your father's former advisor. Bernard. Yes. Bernard is 78 years old, Marcus. I know. But I think there are things about those early years that Bernard may need to tell you. Before someone else tells you first. Monica laughed. The automatic, defensive laugh she reached for whenever the ground beneath her felt uncertain. You're being dramatic. But she didn't sleep well that night. Or the next. The advisor's name was Bernard Castellan. He had served Gerald Brooks for over 30 years, first as a financial consultant, then as a senior advisor, then as something harder to define. A fixer, perhaps. A protector of interests. A man who knew where all the bones were buried because he had helped bury several of them. He lived in a large house on the edge of a golf community, surrounded by the careful quiet of a man who had decided to take his secrets to the grave. He had almost managed it. Monica arrived unannounced, which he had not expected. He opened the door and something flickered in his eyes, just briefly, before he recovered. Monica, he said warmly. What a surprise. Come in. They sat in a sunroom full of potted orchids and afternoon light. He offered her tea. She declined. Bernard, she said. I'm going to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth. He looked at her steadily. A man who had spent decades managing the truth was very good at looking steady. Of course, he said. Was my father's company always his alone? Or did someone build it with him? The steadiness flickered. Where is this coming from? Answer the question, please. Bernard set down his cup. The sound of the porcelain against the saucer was very precise, very controlled. He folded his hands in his lap and looked out at the garden. Your father, he began slowly, was a visionary. What he built. Bernard. He stopped. Was there a partner? A long silence. Yes, he said finally. There was a partner. The room seemed to rearrange itself around Monica. She kept her face very still. His name. James Walker. She said nothing for what felt like a very long time. The orchids sat in their pots. The afternoon light moved slightly across the floor. And what happened to him? Bernard picked up his tea again, looked into it. He died. Heart failure. Gerald was devastated. They were close. And the company? Another silence. Longer this time. Gerald was advised that the cleanest course of action, legally, financially, was to consolidate ownership. To simplify the structure before the business grew further. By removing a dead man's name from the records. Bernard said nothing. By forging his widow's signature. Still nothing. Bernard. Monica's voice was very quiet now. The kind of quiet that precedes storms. Tell me exactly what you did. And he did. Took 40 minutes. He spoke carefully, clinically at first, the way people describe shameful things when they're trying to maintain dignity. Then the clinical distance crumbled. His hands began to shake. His voice lost its shape. He had orchestrated the whole thing. Gerald had known, had agreed, had signed off on the consolidation with the understanding that it was a matter of practicality, not malice. But the signature on Iris Walker's behalf, the altered documents, the redirected assets, that had been Bernard's work. Precise, hidden, legal on the surface, and wrong, deeply, irreversibly wrong. Monica sat in that sunroom and listened to the full story of how her family's fortune had been built on another family's loss. The empire she had spent her adult life expanding, the wealth she had pointed to as proof of her worth, the name she wore like armor. All of it had a different foundation than she'd ever been told. When Bernard finished, the room was very quiet. "Does anyone else know?" Monica asked. "A gardener," Bernard said, and something in the way he said it, the smallness, the dismissiveness, made Monica close her eyes. A gardener. Andre Walker. The man she had handed a check to in front of a crowd of laughing people. The man who had looked at her and said, "One day you'll wish you never gave me this. This is the moment we need to pause. Because what happened next is not just a legal story or a business story. It's a human story. And to reduce it to documents and boardrooms would be to miss what made it matter." If you're still watching up to now, type, "I'm still here" in the comments section. This story is just getting started. Raymond Holt filed the formal legal claim on a Tuesday morning. It was comprehensive, backed by forensic document analysis, archived public records, independent witness testimony, including a signed affidavit from a retired accountant named Preston Hughes, who had worked in Gerald Brooks' financial department during the critical period and had kept his own private records out of what he described as a lifelong guilt he could no longer carry. Preston had reached out to Holt's office directly after hearing, through a mutual contact, that someone was investigating the company's origins. "I'm 74 years old," Preston had said during his deposition. "I watched it happen. I should have spoken then. I was afraid. I'm still afraid, if I'm honest. But I'm more afraid of dying with this in my chest than I am of the consequences." His records were detailed, meticulous. Dates, figures, names. A paper trail that had existed for decades in a storage box in a spare bedroom, waiting for exactly this moment. The claim was filed, and Monica was served. She read the documents alone in her study with the door closed. She read them twice. Then she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. Her legal team immediately began preparing a defense. That was automatic, the institutional response of any organization with assets to protect. But Monica barely heard the strategy sessions. She sat through meetings with her lawyers and said the right words and approved the right responses. And underneath all of it, she felt as though the floor she'd been standing on her entire life had turned to glass, and she could now see everything beneath it. The parties at the estate, the board dinners, the keynote speeches where she had talked about her father's vision, his discipline, his courage, the investments she had called his legacy, the empire she had called her inheritance. All of it was real. None of it was what she thought. And Andre, the man she had mocked in front of a crowd, the man the internet had laughed at for wanting to investigate his family's past, had known. Or rather, he had suspected enough to look. And he had looked hard. She thought about his grandmother, a woman who had insisted, all her life, that something had been stolen, who had kept papers in a leather folder, who had died without ever seeing proof, who had raised a grandson who, 40 years later, had used the very money his employer handed him as a humiliation to finally find the truth. Monica was not a woman who cried easily. She had trained herself out of it long ago, the way many powerful women do, because the world tends to interpret tears as weakness, and she had never been able to afford that interpretation. But sitting alone in her study with those documents on the desk, she cried. The emergency board meeting was convened under tense circumstances. 31 days after the claim was filed, the legal review had reached a point where the evidence was, in the words of the lead attorney, substantially compelling. The board members arrived in a boardroom that felt nothing like the usual venue for their quarterly meetings. Felt like a courtroom. They filed in. Advisors, executives, investors, legal counsel. The air was careful. People spoke in low voices and didn't make eye contact. Monica sat at the head of the table. The doors opened one final time. Andre Walker walked in. He wore a dark suit. His posture was what it had always been, calm, upright, unhurried. He sat down at the far end of the table and placed a folder in front of him. He looked at no one in particular and at everyone simultaneously. Raymond Holt sat beside him. The presentation began. Documents were shared. Forensic analysis was summarized. The history was laid out precisely, clinically, without embellishment, because the facts were already extraordinary enough without dramatization. The room was completely silent for most of it. When Holt finished, he said simply, "The evidence establishes clearly that Mr. Andre Walker, as the primary surviving heir of James Walker, is the rightful co-inheritor of assets that were fraudulently transferred from the Walker estate following James Walker's death. We are seeking the restoration of ownership rights, the recognition of the original partnership structure, and fair compensation for decades of unjust enrichment." An older board member cleared his throat. A lawyer on Monica's side shuffled papers. Someone whispered to someone else. Monica looked at Andre across the length of the table. He looked back at her. She opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she looked down at her hands. And when she looked up again, something in her face had changed. The armor she always wore, the poise, the authority, the unshakable projection of someone who had earned everything she had developed a crack. And through the crack, something honest was showing. "I want to say something," she said. Her lawyer touched her arm lightly. "Monica!" "No." She shook her head gently. "I want to say something." She looked around the room. Then she looked at Andre. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not for the legal matter. My lawyers can address the legal matter. I'm talking about something else." She paused. "I stood in front of my guests, my friends, and I used you to entertain them. I handed you money like a joke. I had no idea what you were carrying. But even if I had, it wouldn't have been acceptable. What I did was cruel. And I'm sorry." The room stayed very quiet. Andre looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not cold. It was not triumphant. It was something more complicated. The expression of a man who had spent months preparing for a fight and had arrived to find that his opponent had already laid down her sword. "Thank you," he said simply. He reached into the folder in front of him and removed a small item. He slid it down the center of the long table. It came to rest near the middle between them. It was a check. $10,000. Monica's signature at the bottom. The same check she had handed him in the garden. "I kept it," Andre said, "because I needed to remember why I started looking." The check sat on the table between them like a relic, something small that had somehow changed the shape of everything. The settlement took months to finalize. These things always do. The legal architecture of what had been taken was complex, layered across decades of business growth, reinvestment, and compound value. What had been a single fraudulent transfer in the early years had, over time, become an enormous inheritance of wealth that now required careful unwinding. Andre did not take everything. This was important, and it mattered to him personally in ways that were hard to articulate in legal language. What he sought was recognition, restoration, a share that reflected what his grandfather's partnership had originally meant. Not punishment, not total destruction. Justice, which is a different thing from revenge, even if from the outside they can sometimes look similar. A formal agreement was reached. It included a financial settlement, the legal restoration of James Walker's name as co-founder in the company's official history, and a public acknowledgement from the Brooks estate of what had occurred. Monica honored every condition. More than honored them, she added one that no one had asked for. She established a foundation in Iris Walker's name. She announced it quietly, without fanfare, in a brief statement that she wrote herself and that her publicist had tried to soften and she had refused to let them. She said what happened. She said that she had benefited unknowingly from a wrong her family had committed. She said that she could not undo history, but she could carry it honestly. And she said that the foundation would support families pursuing legal recognition of stolen inheritances and historical property fraud. It wasn't a redemption tour. She didn't go on podcasts. She didn't write a memoir. She just did the thing and let the thing speak for itself. The day the foundation was announced, Andre received a phone call from Monica. "I thought you should hear it from me directly," she said. I appreciate that, he said. A pause. Your grandmother, Monica said slowly. She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman. Andre was quiet for a moment. She was stubborn, he said. She was patient. She kept records other people would have thrown away. She told me the truth would find me even when I stopped looking for it. He paused. She was right. Yes, Monica said softly. She was. The story ended up being covered widely. The original viral video, the one from the garden party, was viewed now in a completely different light. What people had watched as humiliation they rewatched as the beginning of something. The moment a man accepted an insult and turned it into a search. The moment a check handed as a joke became the funding for a truth that had been buried for decades. Andre gave one interview. Just one. A quiet conversation where he sat still and answered questions without performing. The journalist asked him what he wanted people to take from this. He thought for a moment. My grandmother used to say that the truth is patient, he said. People think that means the truth always wins eventually. I'm not sure that's what she meant. I think she meant that the truth will wait. It will wait as long as it has to. But you have to be willing to do the work when your moment comes. The truth gives you the moment. The rest is up to you. He was asked if he had forgiven Monica. Forgiveness is something I work on, he said carefully. It's not a switch. It's a practice. What I can say is that I don't carry anger toward her. What happened to my family was not her doing. What she did at that party, that was thoughtless, but it was also the thing that pushed me into action. I'm not grateful for the humiliation, but I recognize that without it, I might have stayed comfortable and never looked. He paused. Sometimes the push comes from an unlikely place. What this story asks of each of us is something quiet but profound. It asks us to consider what we know about the people around us, not what they seem to be, not what their circumstances suggest, but what they actually carry. The gardener trimming your hedges, the delivery driver at your door, the woman on the train reading worn papers, the old man in the park who talks to himself. Every one of them has a history that you know nothing about. Every one of them is carrying something. We live in a world that assigns value quickly on surfaces, on signals of income and status and presentation. Monica Brooks was not a villain in the way villains usually appear. She didn't twirl a cape. She didn't scheme. She simply looked at a quiet man with soil on his gloves and saw someone she could afford to dismiss. She was wrong. And it cost her more than she expected, not in money ultimately, but in the understanding of who she was and where she had come from. Andre Walker was not a hero in the way heroes usually appear either. He didn't rage. He didn't demand. He didn't perform his suffering for anyone's satisfaction. He simply accepted an insult, folded a check, and went to work, quietly, steadily, the way his grandmother had taught him. And James Walker, a man who died decades before any of this resolution came, was finally given back his name. Not in a way that can undo time, but in the public record, in the foundation that bears his wife's name, in the legal documents that now carry his signature without apology, in the truth. That is what justice looks like most of the time. Not a dramatic moment where the villain gets what's coming and the hero stands tall. Just a name restored, a record corrected, a grandmother's decades of stubborn, unfashionable insistence proven right. Iris Walker never saw this day, but Andre lived it for her. And that is perhaps the most human thing in this entire story. That the people who most deserve to see the truth vindicated are often the ones who don't live long enough to see it. And the people who carry the inheritance of their suffering are the ones who have to decide what to do with it. Andre decided to seek the truth. He could have spent the money on something else. He could have let the insult fade. He could have told himself the same thing he'd told himself for years, that his grandmother was a grieving woman who had turned loss into legend. Instead, he listened, and the truth found him, just like she said it would. To every person watching this who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, handed something as a joke, laughed at in a room where they were the only one not laughing, this story is for you. Not because it promises that justice always comes. It doesn't. The world is not arranged that way, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. but because it demonstrates what becomes possible when you refuse to let humiliation be the last word. When you fold the insult carefully and put it in your pocket and say, "Not yet. Not yet." Andre Walker didn't return to that boardroom to prove anything to the people who had left. He returned to restore what belonged to his family. There is a difference. And if you understand that difference, if you feel it somewhere in your chest as you finish this story, then you understand what his grandmother meant when she said the truth is patient. It was waiting for him. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for someone watching this too. Thank you for staying with this story from beginning to end. That means everything to us. We put these stories together with real care because we believe that the right story at the right time can shift something in a person. The way they see their circumstances, the way they see others, the way they carry their own history. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you've been through, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what stayed with you, what hit hardest, what made you sit up straight or get quiet or feel something you hadn't expected to feel today. And if you're new here, please subscribe. There are more stories coming, stories of hidden truths, unexpected courage, justice arriving from unusual directions, and the quiet strength of ordinary people carrying extraordinary histories. We'll see you in the next one.